So about 3 weeks ago, I randomly found myself in Anaheim, California, living out one of my lifelong dreams, attending the NAMM show. And as a guitar player, that was probably the single most coolest thing that's ever happened to me, just walking around this conference room, seeing all of my guitar heroes in one room. And because of that, I was a bit overwhelmed, so I wanted to have a friend kind of show me around the room. So that's when I turned to my friend Gabriel. And Gabriel is a fantastic guitar player, one of the best I've seen on any platform. And he's actually my oldest guitar friend. And we're just walking around and he says something to me, something very interesting. He goes, "Mike, they're calling me an analog elitist." And in my mind, I just started cracking up because I was like, what the heck is that? And it suddenly hit me because I've had conversations with Gabriel before. He's a much more knowledgeable guitar player than I could ever be. But he said that he just loves analog gear. He doesn't really dive into the digital world of the Kempers and the Quad Cortexes. He likes to stick to his actual amp. And that got me thinking about how I feel about everything, because in the past year I've had sort of this renaissance, we could call it, with virtual amps, where I've thought to myself, I really love the sound of virtual amps, and I think they've come so far that at some points they could even compete with analog amps. But I didn't want to just say that. I wanted to, as always, put it to the test. Like, how could I see if these things could actually live up? And I knew I couldn't do this alone, so I actually took this experiment to Instagram because I wanted to see what people would think in just a moment's notice. So how I did this, I recorded the same lick 2 times with the same guitar, same settings, one with a virtual amp, one with an analog amp, and all I wanted to see is if people could actually tell the difference. I wanted to see if they could point out which one was the real amp. And before I give you my findings, because I think they were actually pretty interesting, I want to know if you right now can do the same thing. So I'm going to do exactly what I did. I'm going to play you 2 clips, and all you have to do is tell me which one is the real amp. Now I'll give you a second in the comments. Tell me below, which one did you think was real? Now I'm going to show you the second lick. Again, let me know. Which one did you think was the real amp? All right, so our results are in. Can I get a drum roll, please? Not gonna lie, I've heard better drum rolls, but anyway. As for our first clip, to which we got hundreds of votes, 54% said that clip B was the real amp, and 46% said that clip A was the real amp, and clip B was the correct answer. And I felt like this was one of the hardest ones to distinguish, but more on that later. And as for our second clip, the heavier, more distorted tone, clip C got 38% saying it was a real amp, and clip D got 62% saying it was a real amp, and 62% of you were correct. Clip D was in fact the correct amp. Now this posed a very interesting scenario to me. Like I've said before, I've said a lot about how far virtual amps have come, and I wanted to push that to the complete limit. For that exact experiment that I did, the amp used was my most expensive amp that I own, my nicest one. It's a Princeton Reverb, and the virtual amp was just my Logic stock amp. They were both going through this guitar, one of my favorite guitars that I've ever owned, and for the most part, A/Bing it through my speakers for that very first tone, for that very first lick. I was having a hard time telling, and I was the one that played both of those licks and listened to them through the speakers. Now, the interesting part came when we got to C and D, because I spent a good amount of time, and I mean a good amount of time, trying to get that virtual amp as close to it as I could, but I think I knew in the moment, once I A/B'd it back with myself, I think you could tell a little bit more quickly than the clean amps, which whenever I've done these experiments before, I think people have more been able to tell more easily with some of the heavier, more distorted tones, whether or not something sounds real. So let me break that down just a little bit more clearly. Right now, I'm way closer to my speakers, like in the optimal listening position that I can get for this room, and I'm A-Bing it, and I'm thinking to myself more and more that it's less about the EQ when it comes to the distorted tones, and I think it gets a little bit more into like the actual signal flow of what I was using, right? Because for the actual analog amp, for the real amp, I use this Tube Screamer right here, a TS-808, and while the Tube Screamer, I guess, emulation in Logic is fine, I think that's slightly where I should have either used a different plugin or wasn't really able to compete with the actual thing in being able to tell what was the real one. That also gets me thinking into a whole different conversation, because I don't think real is necessarily the synonym for good in terms of like guitar playing, because there are definitely guitar tones that I've heard in the past that don't necessarily sound real, like you can tell they came from a virtual amp, that have maybe some effects on them like a vocoder or something, but that doesn't necessarily mean they sound bad or inadequate. That might actually fit the situation. That's just an interesting one that I've been ruminating on recently. Let me know what you think. When it comes to the big first question that I posed, like, would I call myself a virtual elitist? I don't really know. Like, I definitely see a place for having analog amps, right? For having actual real life amps. I mean, I use the Princeton every day. And even with solutions like the aux box, when it gets late at night and I don't want to completely blow out my neighbors, I think you have all these possibilities. But the plug and play itself, it's amazing when you can just go into Logic, especially like having figured out these little tweaks and these little secrets that I have, or use like, and being able to endlessly change things. Because that's one of the things, like I said, the distorted tone, like the heavier stuff, it was definitely, you could tell the difference. You could tell like what it was doing for the most part, I think for most people. However, that wasn't even the first time that I had tweaked some of those settings. That was one of the more difficult things to do. And I spent like 30 minutes just tweaking different things in the EQ and the high end. But the actual virtual amp allowed me to do that. I was able to tweak some of those things. Whereas with the actual Princeton, once I got the tone, once it was done, it was done. You can't do anything about that. If I wanted to change how much reverb was coming from the amp, if I wanted to change anything about the tremolo or anything about that, I couldn't change that. So I think both areas have their pros and cons. I feel like it's just trying to find out which one works best for you. And who knows how much anyone can even tell inside a mix. By the way, let me know what you think that was, and I might reveal the answer later. And anyway, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for watching. I love talking about the differences between analog and the digital world, or where just the guitar world and the guitar community will go in the not so distant future. Tell me in the comments what you think. Do you think virtual amps are the future and we need to just kick all the analog amps out? Do you think analog will always be the standard and you're never getting rid of your tube amp or a quad cortex or whatever these kids are using nowadays? Let me know what you think in the comments. Like and subscribe if you had a good time, and most importantly, like most important of all, have a fantastic day.